Yeah, if you didn't see the announcement, for some reason, like the recording for the previous, I mean, people who are here probably don't need it, but the recording for the previous lecture didn't take or something. So um, I sent out an email with a link to the Quine lecture that I gave him last time I taught the course, um, which is not exactly the same, obviously, but um, okay. In any case, on to Popper. Um, so he lived a long time. Um, he died, I think, I keep meaning to check this if this is true. I think he died in the same year as Kuhn, actually, even though he was much older. It was definitely around the same time because I remember my roommate at the time was speculating that there was like a planet of space aliens where they were ruled by philosophers of science, and they decided that they were going to conquer the Earth, so they decided they should kill off our prominent philosophers of science first, and then but I don't know. Anyway, and I said that planet would be the planet of the apes. But yeah, so Karl Popper. All right. Um, he was an associate of the Vienna Circle. He was actually from Vienna, and he lived in Vienna until he had to leave because of the Nazis. At which point he first moved to New Zealand and then later moved to England, which is where he spent the rest of his life. Um, so he was kind of an associate of the Vienna Circle, but there was always some discomfort or even hostility between him and the Vienna Circle proper. I mean, we'll see that especially when we read Neurath's critique of Popper later, that Neurath is extremely hostile to him. Um, Carnap and Popper are more like they're trying to they're trying to negotiate between each other, right? To like work things out, but they never really manage to. And after a while, I guess they kind of stopped trying. Um, what else can I say about him? So, first of all, in some sense, he's much more of a philosopher of science than the other people we've read. Um, Um, I mean, he certainly wrote about everything. He didn't feel like like he was a specialist and he can only write about science. Um, but philosophy of science was definitely the center of what he was working on. Um, and I can also say that um, among philosophers, I think he's been a lot less influential than Carnap. Um, um, and to some extent is looked on with suspicion with by a lot of analytic philosophers. Um, on the other hand, I think he was always better liked among scientists. I mean, at least as, I don't know if this is true, maybe like, but especially like natural scientists, like the hard sciences. I'm not sure if it's limited to that. Um, I think that's true to this day, and that if you talk to a scientist about philosophy of science, you're much more likely to hear about Popper than you are to hear about Carnap or Quine or Goodman. Um, although scientists who like him usually tend to forget the part where like uh, observations don't uh, don't ever show that a theory is true or even probable. Right. They like that part they kind of forget because when you mention that, they don't like that. Um, um, he's also, I think, a lot better known than Carnap or the other people who've been reading so far, generally speaking, outside of philosophy. Not necessarily better liked, but better known, partly because of his political writings. Um, as I've mentioned before, he was definitely to the right of Carnap and Neurath. Um, I think like on the current American political spectrum, he would probably be pretty far towards the left, actually. Right? I mean, he was um he was a liberal, right? Not in the American sense of, but I guess what I'm going to say is he was also a liberal in the American sense of liberal, right? Like he was a liberal in the European sense of liberal, that he was in favor of, in the and the I guess original sense of liberal. He was in favor of like a free, like the title of his most important political work is The Open Society, right? So, but he was also, I think, a liberal by American standards in the sense that he was in favor of like uh, the welfare state, that type of thing. So he wasn't like a hardcore libertarian type. So the truth is he wasn't like some kind of extreme right winger, but compared to the Vienna Circle, um, uh, he looked kind of right wing. Um, and compared to maybe a lot of people in academia today, also he looks kind of like right wing. Um, so um, so that partly explains, I think, why he's both better known but also somewhat controversial. Um, um, yeah, I guess I won't say anything more about that at the moment. Are there questions about Popper in general? I probably can't answer them if there are, but I guess I should say he was a difficult character, right? There's a famous story of which someone wrote a whole book about, which I haven't read, but there's a famous story about him chasing Wittgenstein around with a poker from like in the fireplace. Like, or maybe, no, wait, it was Wittgenstein chasing him with a poker. Yeah. But anyway, like, um, uh, he was very argumentative. Uh, he was not that open to alternative opinions, despite that being the cornerstone of his philosophy. um, uh, um, but I guess I should say, I mean, one of the reasons I'm telling this whole history is that I think he's somewhat underestimated. He actually is really interesting philosopher. I mean, there's problems with him as there are with all interesting philosophers, but I think he's worth reading. Um, so, um, and we have an advantage in having this edition. Now, I actually don't have the edition with me at this point. I should pick it up and show it to you. I have a PDF of it with me, but I don't have the. I forgot to bring the hard copy. But yeah, so our advantage of having this edition of the logic of scientific discovery. So the logic of scientific discovery, or in German, it's called Logik der Forschung. I try to say something more about what that means, but in English, it's called the logic of scientific discovery. And it was first published in 1935, but it wasn't translated into English until 1959. So similar to the Aufbau, like it was for a long time, it was only available in German. And if people who didn't know German wanted to learn about Popper, they would have to read some of his later stuff that he wrote in English. Um, so we have an advantage in having this book in English at all. Um, and second of all, this edition has Popper's later notes. Um, So, I mean, you should take a look at the translator's note at the beginning that explains what the different symbols mean. But basically, if there's like a little asterisk before a footnote number, that means it's a later note. I forget exactly what year he added though. I mean, I think there might be more than one layer of them, but I forget exactly what year he added those in. But they're much later. Um, um, So, I mean, those notes can help because one of the purposes, there's a lot of purposes of those notes. But one of the purposes of them in Popper's mind, I think, is that he's learned that there's certain ways he tends to be misunderstood, and he wants to head off those misunderstandings. Um, so, um, that's good, although it's also a little bit dangerous, right? Like if we're really interested in what did Popper think in 1935, then we can't necessarily take later Popper's word for it. Um, as I've said before in this course, I think philosophers are not necessarily reliable interpreters of their own earlier works in a in a historically rigorous sense because they're um um because well it's similar to the advantages and disadvantages of philosophers as readers of philosophy in general that I mean the advantage is that uh uh they have a lot of understanding of what this person is trying to say because it's something in this case something they themselves literally thought before, right? um but the disadvantage is that they're not just trying to settle a historical issue about what they used to mean. They're trying to make sense of it and make it usable for their current projects, basically. So that can be distorting. So those footnotes are valuable, but I don't know of anything in particular that I find really distorting about them. So I'm not warning about some particular problem, but that's just like a general caveat. Okay, having said all of that, um, now I'll start talking about what it actually says in the book. First, I have to open the PDF. So, the um, main questions of the book are asked in the first few sentences on page 3. Um, um, the task of the book is um, to give a logical analysis of this procedure. What procedure? Well, the procedure of empirical science. That is to analyze the method of the empirical sciences. That's the end of the sentence. And then he asks, but what are these methods of the empirical sciences? And what do we call empirical science? Um, so, right, those two sentences list um, um, what are these methods? So that's the question of methodology. The logical characterization of the method of empirical science. And the second one, and what do we mean by empirical science, is what Popper calls the demarcation problem. Right? How do we decide what counts as empirical science and what doesn't? Um, and the answer to the demarcation problem is going to be Popper's most famous uh, thesis, right? That the answer to the demarcation problem has to do with falsifiability. Empirical sciences or are disciplines that put forward falsifiable theories. Um, Now, I mean, what does that mean? So, like, um, it's important. This is something that I've noticed over the years can cause confusion. It's important to notice the difference between falsifiable and falsified, right? Uh, um, um, Sciences don't want to put forward falsified theories, right? Falsified theories are theories that have been shown to be false. Um, but scientists want to put forward falsifiable theories, that is, theories that could be falsified by further observations. Now, it's true that as time goes on, some of those theories will be falsified. And then, we recognize that they were good scientific theories in their time, but, they're no longer accepted. Um, because, I mean, they definitely were empirical scientific theories because if they were falsified, then they were certainly falsifiable, right? But again, we hope that the theories that we accept now will not be falsified, but will be falsifiable. Um, and this is important not just to rule out a certain like simple confusion, but also because this distinction like marks out two different uses for observation statements, or what Popper calls basic statements. Like, on the one hand, you use some actual accepted basic statement to falsify a theory. Actually, it's more complicated than that. We'll see. It's not just one statement that falsifies a theory. But roughly speaking, you use some accepted basic statement, um, observation statement, although Popper says this is not exactly what the Vienna Circle means by protocol sentences. Okay, but it's something like that. Observation statements, you use some actual one to falsify a theory. So the theory will actually be falsified when you accept the statement that falsifies it. And again, it turns out it actually requires more than just one statement. It's more complicated, but roughly speaking, that's the story. Whereas, but when you're just trying to look at the theory and see if it's an empirical scientific theory, then you want to consider all possible basic statements and see if any of them would falsify it. Right, so there's one use for the actual accepted basic statements, and there's another use for all possible basic statements. So Popper has to talk about both of those things. Um, and um, this answer to the demarcation problem is not something that everyone agrees with. I mean, probably everyone here knows this, but but like sometimes I think because of that popularity he has within the sciences, people start to think that, oh yeah, all philosophers agree. What makes a theory a scientific, empirical scientific theory is that's falsifiable. But no, I mean, that's Popper's view, but verificationists, as that's Popper's term for them, right? Or justificationists, um, people who think that theories can be supported and not just contradicted by observations don't agree with this. In particular, they typically think that being falsifiable is not enough to make something an empirical scientific theory. It has to be possible to support it with observations. not just to falsify it with observations. But Popper's view is that no, this is what counts. Okay, so that's the answer to the demarcation problem, and that's what he starts talking about first in the book. But in some sense, so like in that early paragraph, this question comes first. And in some sense, this comes logically first. Um, because it's going to turn out that the reason the empirical scientific theories have to be falsifiable is because the procedure or methodology of empirical science involves using a theory in a certain way, and that way that you want to use it in requires that the theory be falsifiable. So in other words, it's this question that gets answered first, and then because of that, we get this answer to the demarcation problem. Um, and that's important to realize because sometimes a theory can be falsifiable, but if it's not used in the right way, then it's not being used in according to the methodology of empirical science. Um, so this is what Popper says about, I think I've mentioned this example before. This is what Popper says about 20th century Marxism, right? He says that Marx's theory was falsifiable, right? It made all kinds of predictions, but then the predictions didn't come true. Right? Like the business cycle didn't really get more and more extreme. There was no revolution in industrialized countries, but there was a revolution in a, like a non-industrialized country, et cetera, right? Um, so, I mean, I'm not pushing this version myself, but I'm trying to say enough about it to see why Popper would think this is a plausible account. Popper says, and how did the 20th century Marxists react to this? Not by saying, oh, I guess that was a bad theory, but by saying, um, oh, but actually, under these conditions, whatever, right? So no, the theory is not falsified. In other words, like setting up by um, adopting stratagems to protect the theory against observations. This is also what Popper thinks that some uh, classical physicists have been doing in the face of modern physics, right? Like confronted by relativity and quantum mechanics, some classical physicists started making moves to defend Newtonian physics from being falsified. So when you do that, you have a falsifiable theory. It's an empirical scientific theory, but you're not using it right, according to Popper. Um, so therefore, I'm going to talk about this part because of what I was just saying of like what really takes precedence here. I'm going to talk about this part and then talk more about this part. Um, I think, by the way, that the order that Popper discusses these in the book has itself, it gives rise to a feeling that Popper has changed his mind somehow. That there's like an evolution from, so, right, like this is basically chapter 1, and this is chapter 2. So, I mean, there's an impression that a lot of people have that kind of Popper's real view was this very simple view that, theories are falsifiable, and as soon as we find one observation that contradicts the theory, we automatically should give up the theory. And then they point out various reasons that's not plausible, that we don't actually do that, etc. Then when you get to chapter 2, Popper himself says, um, this is on page 28. Um, is it on page 28? Right, here it is. In point of fact, no conclusive disproof of a theory can ever be produced. Right? So Popper admits that. It's true. You can't disprove a theory by a single observation. In fact, you can never conclusively disprove it. Um, but since he put it in this order, it gives the impression of like the simple thing was what he wanted to say, but he was forced to change his mind and allow this, right? Whereas as Popper himself points out in in footnotes, like obviously he published both of these at the same time. He didn't change his mind between this one and that one. Right. So it's better to look at the methodology first. Um, so first some basic things like so this word Forschung, um, usually this is translated as research. That would be the most standard translation of Forschung. Um, uh, Although I think there's more emphasis on the search than you hear in the English word, even though it doesn't actually have a part meaning search in it, but it's more emphasis on the search, right? It's like exploration could be another sense. Um, and in that sense, it can be translated as discovery, right? It's like finding out. Um, so, uh, um, in English, they could have translated as logic of discovery. By the way, when I say they could have translated it, so the Popper himself is listed as the translator with the assistance of, I forget, I always forget their names. So, no, I don't know. It says here somewhere. I don't know where it says it. Anyway, Popper himself translated it with the assistance of these two people that he mentions. I kind of assume that those people did most of the translation and Popper reviewed it, but I'm not sure. Maybe Popper did most of the translation and they reviewed it. Um, so I mean, so anyway, I mean, this is a pretty authorized translation, and yet, like, there's all kinds of problems that come up in the translation, and I think that's an indication of actually, like how hard it is to translate philosophy from one language to another. Even the author, it sets up problems that even the author himself can't solve. Um, and there's one, I think, in the title, like, didn't want to call it logic of research in English. That wouldn't give the right indication. Logic of discovery would be even worse, right? And you would think it'd be like Christopher Columbus or something, like so logic of. So that's why I put in scientific. Um, okay, um, and the logic of scientific discovery, or as he also calls it in German, he just calls it Forschungslogik. um, they have these really long words in German, but we really have them in English too. We just put spaces in, right? Um, like if you say strategic arms limitation treaty. So that's just like four nouns in a row without any prepositions or anything combining them, right? It's really just one word, and you have to figure out how these nouns are related to each other. So in German, they would write that without spaces in between. That's um, so anyway, so you have these long words, but really just long phrases. So yeah, it's research logic, scientific research logic. What does that mean? Um, well, so first of all, what we're doing here is setting up systems of statements. A scientist, whether theorist or experimenter, puts forward statements or systems of statements. Um, so it's not systems of concepts, right? This is the thing I've been emphasizing since the right. This the whole course is um, organized around that a scientist doesn't choose good concepts. A scientist chooses systems of statements. I think that was bad. um, right. So, um, and I think you'll see in this reading that Popper specifically mentions this point, right? Says that um, uh, the positivists used to think that the main point of empirical science was to have empirical concepts, but now they're coming to realize that it's really about empirical statements. And then one of these starred footnotes that says, actually, they weren't really coming to realize that. I found out later, right? So, um, so, I mean, he understands, but this is not Carnap's or Quine's understanding of it. He understands the importance of contextual definition or definition in use, right? But remember, we don't tell you how to substitute some phrase for the word that's being defined. We just tell you how to translate every sentence that includes that word into a sentence that doesn't include it, right? So, like, if I say 1/2 is greater than 2/3. That's not true, but I could say it, right? Okay, so I say 1/2 is greater than 2/3, and I want to translate this into a sentence that only mentions natural numbers. So I can't do it by substituting one expression involving natural numbers for 1/2 and another for 2/3. Rather, I have to translate the whole sentence, right? So I translate it to, for all x, if um, two x for all x for all y, if 2x equals 3y, then y is greater than 2x. I think I got that right. Anyway, something like that, right? um, so, uh, um, so Popper understands this to mean that the unit of meaning was really the sentence to begin with. And that's why the problem is how to translate the sentence into another sentence, not how to translate the concept into another concept. All right, so we're putting forward systems of statements, and then there's a logic of that. So what does he mean by logic in this context? Um, and he really only explains it towards the end of chapter 2. um, where he says that, so, and this is actually a Kantian distinction, um, which I think Popper is well aware of. Right, you probably noticed that Kant has come back, right? Like in the footnote at the end of chapter 2. This is the footnote. Yeah. The classical and the modern theory of knowledge, parentheses, from Hume via Kant to Russell and Whitehead, right? Whereas in Quine, somehow it went from Hume via Bentham and that other guy whose name I've already forgotten again, the American guy, um, to Russell and Whitehead. So, right, so there's a Kantian distinction here, and it's between pure logic, as Popper calls it, or you might call it general logic, and the logic of X. For example, the logic of scientific discovery, right? And Popper says pure logic, and here he's completely in line with the Vienna Circle. Pure logic is about tautologies and tautological transformations, right? That is um, uh, things that are true no matter what the world is like because they don't say anything about the world. Um, and ways you can transform them that preserves that. They're true due to the meaning of the terms. Like, for example, tomorrow at this location, it will rain, or tomorrow at this location, it will not rain. Or maybe you should, to put it better, you should say, either tomorrow at this location it will rain, or not tomorrow at this location it will rain. So Ray Popper says that's, and the Vienna Circle agrees with this, that's tautologous. That's why it's a logical truth. It doesn't, you don't have to know what will rain or this location means. Whatever they mean, um, by virtue of the meaning of not and or, this sentence has to be true. So Popper says pure logic is about the rules for, forming sentences that must be true or that must be false because they contradict themselves, right? And how to transform them to preserve that property. But the logic of X, he says, is like the rules of the game of X. So he says, like, we could well call the rules of chess the logic of chess. Um, Now, Popper later on expressed some regrets about that metaphor because he said it made it sound like it was just a game, right? That there wasn't something serious going on. Um, but um, I think what he's thinking here, and what I think is right, is that something can both be a game and be really serious, right? It can be a game with a really important purpose. Uh, and so that's the way he thinks about this. These are rules that tell you like what kind of moves you're allowed to make. So he gives as an example, and these are going to be the methodological rules. So methodology of X is the study of the logic of X. That is the rules of the game of X. That is what you're allowed to do if you want to do X. Right? So like if I want to, move the rook in some weird way, that's not like unethical, let alone illogical, right? I'm not contradicting myself by doing that, but I'm not playing chess. Um, So the methodology, um, and Popper says methodology proposes rules, says let's count following these rules as being an empirical scientist. Just as we can imagine someone proposing, let's follow these rules and count that as playing chess. Um, and Popper says because this is in the terminology that Carnap favored, this is practical, not theoretical. So, I mean, Popper, I don't think Popper ever used the, no, I shouldn't say that. Popper wrote a ton. I'm not sure. But Popper doesn't usually use the term theoretical that way as the opposite of practical, right? He's usually using theoretical, meaning having to do with a theory. And he's used, so it's theoretical as opposed to observational, basically. Um, um, but you could use those theoretical, practical terms to explain what he's saying here. Methodology is practical, not theoretical. It's not descriptive. Its purpose is not to erect a theory, which then we're going to see whether it's right or not. Like, my theory is that scientists do this. Now let's check it. Popper says a theory like that would be very interesting. And if it's falsifiable, it would be a scientific theory. Um, and if we have, although Popper is like unsure to what extent we have this now, right? Right? If we have a properly empirical science of sociology or something like that, then this would be a fine thing for them to investigate. What do scientists actually do? Uh, but methodology is not a description of what scientists actually do. It's a proposal for a convention as to what we're going to call empirical science. So a proposal for a convention is neither true nor false, right? Like, are the rules of chess true? Um, so and this is Popper's response from the very beginning, although um, as you can see from the footnotes and so forth, um, he kept having to fight this over and over again. Popper's response to the question, okay, Popper, so what about your theory? Is your theory falsifiable? Popper said, no, my theory is not an empirical scientific theory. My theory is methodology. It's a proposed convention. It's not supposed to be falsifiable. It's not, what I'm doing is not a part of empirical science. So, I mean, this is very similar to Carnap, right? He's saying like the only thing that lies between pure logic, the analytic, the tautological, and empirical science is not some kind of super empirical theoretical discipline, but rather practice, right? That's the kind of thing that can be that's neither a logical truth nor an empirical truth, is not a truth at all, but is a convention or proposal or something like that. So, I mean, I think at that level, Carnap and Popper agree, but there's also a big disagreement because um, Popper thinks there's a science of this. You can study this. You can erect a system of methodological rules. Um, it's not an empirical science, uh, but um, but there's a lot to say about it. Carnap although he sometimes talks about things like that, I think less and less as time goes on, strictly speaking, is committed to the view that um, everything you say about this is would be meaningless, right? I mean, if it doesn't have empirical content, and then remember there was something about at the end of the Aufbau about sort of allowing logic and mathematics to count as like part of science because they're connected to it in a certain way. Um, which I think he continues to think something along those lines as time goes on. So, right, so this tautological stuff, even though it has no empirical content, it kind of gets in with the stuff that does have empirical content. But other than that, there's nothing else you can say that's meaningful. So Popper, I mean, so Carnap doesn't think that there's, well, doesn't think that there's a science of ethics. At least after the Aufbau, he doesn't. In the Aufbau, he talks about constructing values and stuff like that, but he quickly turns away from that. Because I mean that ethics wouldn't be ethics, right? It would say such and such values exist, but it wouldn't tell you what to do. Um, whereas Popper thinks there's a whole big thing you can say about what to do. And this goes along with the general point, which is that this demarcation, Popper says, is not a line between meaningless and meaningful. Right? He says, I don't agree with the people who think that anything that's not empirical science is meaningless. No, metaphysics is meaningful. Methodology is meaningful. It's not empirical science. Um, so against this is the view that Popper calls naturalism. Um, I don't know where to write this. And I also don't know what to call the opposite point of view. But the idea that there's a science of methodology is, which is not itself part of empirical science, is opposed to the view that Popper calls naturalism. Um, Namely that, well, I mean, I guess narrowly speaking, you might say naturalism is the view that philosophy is part of empirical science or should be. Right? So that was one of the meanings of naturalized, the official main meaning of naturalized in the title of Quine's Epistemology Naturalized. We're going to make epistemology part of empirical science, in particular part of psychology, Quine says. Um, but uh, but more generally, Popper says naturalism is the view that only empirical science is meaningful, which I guess Quine also sort of buys into, only since he can't make a sentence by sentence distinction between what has empirical content and what doesn't. It doesn't really amount to ruling anything out as nonsense metaphysics in Quine's hands. But still, I think Ray Quine agrees that empirical science is all the output that's somehow based on our sense data. Again, that's weird. I mean, like everything we say, even literal nonsense, right? Like ba 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 ba. Like somehow that was caused by my sense data, I guess, that I had the rest of my life. um, so it caused me to say that. And yet that wasn't part of empirical science. But anyway, I'm not talking about Quine, we're talking about Popper. So yeah, so Popper says, no, I don't agree with this. I don't agree with naturalism. He says actually naturalism itself is a proposed methodology. It's a proposed convention that for the use of the word meaningful, right? That we're going to only call things that are part of empirical science meaningful. And there's two problems with that. I think the first problem is that Popper doesn't think that's a good proposal for the use of the word meaningful. It's not a convenient use of the word meaningful for various reasons. Um, but moreover, Popper says it's especially bad because the people who say this tend to not regard it as a proposal, but as a statement of fact. And he says, when you have something that's actually a proposed convention, but you think of it as a statement of fact, then it becomes a dogma, right? Because it's really practical, it can't be refuted. It can't be falsified, right? Like, so the rules of chess can't be falsified. No matter how many times I move the rook the wrong way, that doesn't falsify the rule that it moves this way, right? So, and yet if I understand that that's because it's not true or false, it's a proposal for what to do or what to call something or whatever, then that's fine. But if I start thinking of it as describing something that, however, mysteriously can't be contradicted by any empirical evidence, then I become a dogmatist. There's something I maintain that I'm not willing to give up. I maintain it's true, but there's no conditions under which I'm willing to give it up. Yeah.
I think this under like the political angle that we discussed earlier, but how much do you think is like a response to Marx?
I mean, it's complicated. It's certainly like, uh, so it's complicated because Quine is definitely not a Marxist, right? Now, I mean, this isn't a response to Quine, but because Quine is still in the future at this point. I mean, he's alive, I guess, but not right. So it's not a response to Quine, but it's I mean, it's a response to a type of position that Quine certainly exemplifies, right? So it's certainly not only a response to Marxism, um, but yeah, I think just as Carnap is trying to find a way to be a physicalist in order it's not so much that he wants himself to count as an orthodox Marxist, but he wants to close the distance between himself and Neurath. So he wants to propose something that sounds like materialism. Um, so similarly, I think Popper wants to uh, rule this out partly because it distances him from Marxism. Um, and again, and put those two things together, and you can see why this particular hostility between Popper and Neurath. Also, some of the hostility between Popper and Putnam that we're going to see later is also related to that. So, I mean, we had usually by this time of the course, we've read a little bit of Putnam already, but we haven't read Putnam yet. But Putnam in the 60s, by the time I knew him, this was not true anymore. He had calmed down a lot. But in the 60s, he was a Maoist and he would like stand in Harvard Square wearing like black pajamas and hand out revolutionary literature. So when we read Putnam's response, like critique of Popper, we'll see again it isn't actually on this point exactly that it, they that they conflict with each other. But yeah, so that's a good question, but the answer is partly, I guess. um, okay. Um, and yeah, I mean, maybe it's also like a diagnosis of what, because remember, from Popper's point of view, right? I should say, by the way, that Popper himself was briefly, in his college days, was like a member of the, um, uh, well, basically of Marxist organization, right? So, and then he turned against it. Um, so that often you get the most angry critics of something from the people who used to be it. Right? Yeah,
I always knew Popper's guy who just hated psychoanalysis.
that's the other big one, right? It's 20th century Marxism and Freudian psychoanalysis. I'm gonna get to talk about both of those, I hope, if I don't waste too much time. Um, Yeah, oh, so anyways, I was saying, so like Popper, I think thinks there's a kind of tragedy to the history of Marxism, right? Like it started off as a good, but maybe there's kind of a diagnosis in here of why it happened, because Marx embraced some form of naturalism and that led to dogmatism. I'm not sure. I mean, I'm sure Popper actually talks about this somewhere, but not something I've read. All right. Anyway, um, so, okay, so I mean, um, what we seem to have at this point is that what Popper's doing is floats completely free of the facts about science. Right? It's a proposal for what to count as science. Um, um, and if, for example, if people want to claim that, no, actually, look, Popper, scientists use induction. You say induction is no good, but scientists use it all the time. So Popper will say, and he does say this in this reading, something like this, well, sometimes scientists do the wrong thing, right? Just like sometimes chess players cheat or whatever, right? That doesn't mean that these are the wrong rules. It means uh, that if we accept these rules, we'll have to say that those scientists were in violation when they did that. And maybe we'll have to say there were a lot fewer good empirical scientists than we thought. Maybe we'll have to say there's none. Right? Maybe we could accept this, we could accept some definition according to which there are no empirical scientists and there never have been. Because we're not talking about empirical facts, we're just talking, it's all practical. So, I mean, and like if that were the outcome, this would be bad for, especially for Kuhn. We're going to read at the end of the course, right? Because Kuhn bases, and it's not explicitly a critique of Popper. I mean, uh, um, well, I'll explain when we get to Kuhn in what sense why I think of it as basically a response to Popper, even though there's a lot of problems with that. Um, that the basis for Kuhn's critique is to look through the history of science and the current day sociology, I guess you could say, of science, and see what scientists have actually done and how scientific breakthroughs were actually achieved and what that meant and what scientists usually do when they're not making a breakthrough and so forth. And on that basis say, look, this is a bad understanding of what science is. And you might think Popper could come back and say, oh yeah, well, okay, science is bad. I mean, that stuff's not science, right? Yeah, okay, Newton's not science, etc. Um, but I guess kind of obviously, um, he wouldn't really want to say that. And I mean, I think you can see why if you think back to the rules of chess, I mean, so like in principle, I can suggest anything as the rules of chess and suggest that we only count people doing that as playing chess. And I can't be wrong. Well, maybe it could be the game I described could be not very fun or something. In that sense, I could be wrong. That is, it could be, my proposal could be not be suitable to my purpose. And right, that's important. That's why there's anything to discuss here at all. Right? Why it's not just, oh, arbitrarily, you could choose this, you could choose this, right? I mean, we want science to do something. So just what we want from chess is, I guess, is it fun? I don't know. Anyway, there's some kind of excitement or interest that people get out of playing chess. Right? If the rules were really bad, then they wouldn't get that anymore. Like if you turn chess into tic-tac-toe or whatever. Right. So, but yeah, you might say, but I couldn't be wrong in the sense that my proposal was false. And so I don't have to look and see what people actually do when they play chess before I make my proposal. But that's not right because we already use the word chess for something. Right. So if my proposal is totally at odds with that, and if moreover that's a thing that people find that interest or excitement in, then uh, what I'm saying isn't false exactly, but it's like um, it's very inconvenient, right? That would not be a good way to use the word chess. Everyone would get all confused about what you meant. um, there would be a danger of you disrupting this valuable thing that people are already doing if anyone listened to you, which they probably wouldn't. um, so right, so like similarly, it's not exactly true that Popper isn't in any way responsible to the actual history of philosophy. And I want to read something. So this is from uh, did I mention, I might have mentioned this before because there's one of these volumes about Carnap too. There's something called the Library of Living Philosophers, um, where they published these big volumes. I don't think they're still putting it out, but where they published these big volumes. And the idea was, and they're edited by Shilp, Paul Shilp, I think. So sometimes people call them the Shilp volumes. And the idea was like, if only someone had like bothered to ask the great philosophers questions and make objections and get their replies to it when they were still alive, think how much we would have learned from that. So, I mean, I don't, I think this just, this just gives more material that you have to try to interpret. It didn't really achieve that. But it has a lot of interesting stuff in it. And it basically usually has like an autobiographical statement from the philosopher at the beginning. And then like they invite various people to write something about the philosopher. And then the philosopher responds to all those things that people wrote. So there's one for Carnap, there's one for Popper, there's a bunch of other ones. Um, and so this is from Popper's response to Lakatosh's contribution to the Shilp volume, um, which we're actually going to read some of that later. But this is Popper's response. And he says, so he starts by the title of this section is The Question of the Falsifiability of My Methodology, right? And he starts by saying, a question that I am almost regularly asked by intelligent students on their first acquaintance with my work is the following. But is your own theory of falsifiability falsifiable? And he says, now, while this is a very natural question, it should not be asked by anyone familiar with my work. And then he goes on to say what I've basically just been saying about it, right? And then he says, surprisingly, Professor Lakatosh asks, under what conditions would you give up your demarcation criterion? As if I had never dealt with this question. Um, So actually, I mean, I skipped the part where he says, I actually did talk about this at length somewhere. But but he says, but here I can give a new reply. I shall give up my theory if Professor Lakatos succeeds in showing that Newton's theory is no more falsifiable by, quote, observable state of affairs than is Freud's. Right? So Popper is saying, yeah, if it turned out that my demarcation criterion couldn't distinguish between Newton and Freud, I would give it up. Meaning either that it would turn out that Freud's theory is falsifiable, I guess, but that's not mostly what he's worried about, and that's not what Lakatos is claiming. If it turned out that Newton's theory was not any more falsifiable, Popper would say, okay, falsifiability was not a good demarcation criteria. And that would also mean that his methodological proposals, which, as I'm going to explain, are proposals that require you to use falsifiable theories, had to be given up. So if, I mean, so Lakatos probably can't show that, but Kuhn maybe does show something like that. Yeah.
Does his criticism of psychoanalysis extend to Lacan? Because I feel like that's more falsifiable with like the graphs and all that.
I don't, first of all, I have to admit, I know what Lacan is, but I haven't read Lacan. And I don't think Popper had read Lacan. So I mean, he's talking about Freud.
Okay.
Yeah. And I mean, remember, he's a contemporary of Freud's. So, yeah.
Did not like Lacan.
Oh, he did write about Lacan somewhere? Okay, and he didn't like him? Well, I believe that if he read it, he wouldn't like it, but I'm not sure why he wouldn't like it, not having read Lacan myself. Um, so yeah, I mean, what he says about Freud is that the theory is designed in advance to account for any possible observations so that it couldn't be falsified by anything. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. I mean, my teacher and the the only person I usually refer to as my teacher in that simple terms, Stanley Cavell, was very into Freud. Um, uh, I could never quite get into it the way he did. Um, and partly, I think, because I did have something of Popper's feeling, even though like if I were to answer the demarcation problem, it would be different than Popper. I had something of Popper's feeling that this was like non-science trying to put itself forward as science in a kind of like dishonest way, I guess. But um, anyway, um, but anyway, the reason I read that was not to make a point about Freud, but to make a point about Popper's relationship to the history of science. It's not an empirical theory about how science works, but that doesn't mean that it's not responsible in some way to what scientists and what certain and this is Kuhn's term, but it's very appropriate here, what certain paradigm cases of scientists have done, right? Like there's some people that have whose theories and actions, uses of those theories have inspired Popper to put forward this view. And if you can show that this view shuts them out, then he would have to give it up. Um, um, how much time do I have left? I should. Okay, so I was gonna give a big uh I was going to give a big discussion of the word experience and the different German words it can translate, but I think I should put that off because it's going to come up more clearly a little bit later. So, I mean, but just to say that Popper says that this methodology is going to be a theory of experience. It's going to be a theory of that is going to be a theory of what learning from experience means. So empirical science is going to be sciences that learn from experience. There are other disciplines that can't learn from experience, but they might also be valuable for various reasons, including metaphysics. Like Popper says, a lot of metaphysics has been useful. um, uh, but on the other hand, Popper thinks there's something really important about having a discipline that does learn from experience in his sense of experience. Um, um, and in particular, I think he says that learning from experience is what makes a view or a discipline objective. Now, I mean, he's using objective in, I think, not the right way to use objective, but the usual way to use objective. So, objective meaning, as he puts it, it doesn't depend on anyone's whim. Um, we can we can, so to speak, although it's not exactly this, but we can, so to speak, compel each other to recognize things. Um, um, so, I mean, if that's right, then this game is really very serious, right? Proposing rules for it is proposing rules for what you should do to be objective. um, to say things that are potentially binding on everyone, so to speak. Temporarily, that's very important to Popper, temporarily binding on everyone. Because you've said in advance under what conditions you're going to give it up. Um, and anyone can meet those conditions. Anyone at any place or any time, as he says, right, can meet those conditions and therefore force you to give it up. Um, so that's the overall methodological point. We're looking for a way of arriving at theories that I think one way to put it is this, that you can object to it, um, but not just because in my opinion, I don't think so. Right? Like, so if someone says vaccines are safe and effective, you can't say, nah, no, I don't think so. That's just your opinion, dude. Right? that like uh, anyone at any place and time can object to it, but only by falsifying. And we have rules of how that has to work. Right? I mean, one of the rules, and this sounds a lot like it could be a rule of a board game, although most board games have the opposite rule for good reason, right? One of the rules is you can't ever stop testing your theories. If you stop exposing your theory to further tests, then you've retired from the game, promises. Um, so, um, so the idea is to have things that everyone has to accept unless they can falsify it. And we've explained how it can be falsified. Um, and then Popper says, so the thing we want to have, that we want to have people accept unless they can falsify it, is a system of statements. So it's a system of sentences that can be either true or false. And now the question is, what characteristics does that system of sentences have to be usable in this game? So, I mean, even if it has those characteristics, I can still use it the wrong way. Um, but if it doesn't have those characteristics, and this is actually what Popper says is the difference between Marx and Freud, right? Popper says Marx's theory is falsifiable. Some people have used it in a way to make it unfalsifiable, right? But the theory itself has the right characteristics, whereas Popper says Freud's theory is not falsifiable to begin with. It would fail this logical test. So, right, we have a test that we can subject a system of statements to determine whether it's usable in this game of putting forward theories that are to be accepted unless you can falsify them, right? To be accepted, but subject to test. So in that context is where Popper brings up the problem of induction. I'm just gonna erase it. I definitely erase this stuff. I should erase this. All right. So induction, first of all, inductivism, the view that the main procedure of scientists is induction. So I think that itself could be seen as part of methodology, but it results in an answer to the demarcation problem. A scientific theory is a theory that can be supported or disconfirmed by induction. Um, so, um, right, and this is, Hempel or Goodman take this for granted. What's a scientific theory? It's a general theory, and it usually has a form like, you know, for all x, if x is A, then x is B, right? I mean, it's not gonna normally have a form like this. Everything is A, right? Such a theory would not be very useful. Possibly we couldn't even know this if everything had the characteristic. um, let's throw out various questions about transcendental predicates and whatever mixed up in there. But in any case, scientific theories usually look like this. At least that's the way these people think about it. I mean, does quantum electrodynamics really look like that? No, so I guess. I don't know. Anyway, so so for everything, if it's an emerald, it's green. If it's a raven, it's black, et cetera, et cetera. So the inductivist says, um, you know, this is a um, this is a good theory if it somehow follows from individual observations like this. Right? A is a raven and A is black, or A is an emerald and A is green. Um, and so the demarcation criterion will be between general statements that somehow follow from singular statements and general statements that don't. And the problem, Popper says, and he attributes this insight to Hume, is that no general statements follow from statements like this. Well, no truly general statements. This is already getting close to Goodman's territory. right? Because Popper has to admit that, like, if A is a person in the room right in this room right now, and B is, you know, understands English, well, this is a general statement, presumably true, and you can prove it by checking each person in the room and seeing if they understand English. Um, let's assume we have a test for that. And uh, and so this general statement will follow from a bunch of statements like this. So, Popper has to add that when he talks about a general or universal statement, he doesn't mean anything that has a universal quantifier out in front. It has to be, it can't be merely numerically universal. In German, he says it has to be specifically universal, right? That's like the old Aristotelian distinction between numerical and specific difference. Numerical difference is the way, like, Socrates and Plato are different from each other, even though they're both human beings. Whereas specific difference is the way Socrates and Plato are different from Bucephalus. Bucephalus is Alexander the Great's horse, because they belong to different species, right? So in German, he somehow, I don't really understand exactly how he's applying it here. In German, he alludes to that contrast. In English, they translate it as numerically universal versus strictly universal. And that, again, Popper himself decided to make that change. I'm not sure exactly why. Maybe he wanted to connect with certain things in formal logic in England. But so in any case, a strictly universal statement is, well, it's kind of by definition one that doesn't follow any finite number of statements like this. um, uh, but another way of putting it, and the way Popper puts it, is it's a statement that can be tested at any place or time. And he says scientific theories have to be testable at any place or time. That's what makes them completely objective. They're accessible to anyone to criticize. So you can't tell from the logical form. You can't even necessarily tell from the words. Yeah.
Well, the way that I was thinking of this is like, there's no like kind of scope restriction to the defined.
But there's no scope restriction. If A means is a person in this room now, then and B means understands English. So I assume this is true, and it's true in the most unrestricted sense of the quantifier you can come up with. So it's not about, well, I mean, so first of all, that's not exactly what scope restriction means. Scope is about like what the quantifier governs, but yeah, it's not about domain restriction, right? It's and as I was going to say, it's also, you can't tell from the translation into English. Popper says a biological term like dog can be used in two different ways. In one way, dog means one of the descendants, and this is like what would officially mean in biology, right? Like all dogs are descendants of one common ancestor. And only those things count as dogs. So if you say something like, all dogs are always hungry or whatever, and you would be saying each of these finite, although large number of things in that all live on the earth, or a few of them have lived a little bit away from the earth, right? But basically all in this little confined spatiotemporal range. They're always hungry, and that would be a numerical universal, and it wouldn't be a good scientific theory. But if by dog you mean a creature with such and such characteristics, which is the way maybe like we in ordinary life tend to think about biological species. Uh, right? Like when you're teaching your kid what dog means, you don't say, well, you see, there was this animal X million years ago, and all its descendants are what we call dogs. Right? You say like a dog is furry and it says woof, woof, and I don't know, stuff like that, right? So there could be something that's furry and says woof, woof in another galaxy. It wouldn't be a dog in the first understanding of dog, but it would be a dog in the second understanding of dog. And if you mean dog that way, then this is certainly universal. This being all dogs are always hungry. I suppose that's not literally true, although it seems like it's true. All right. So, so if by universal statement you mean the kind of statement that a scientific theory ought to use for methodological reasons, then they can never be proved by induction. And Popper says, he goes into this like a dilemma, right? Like you can see that they could never be proved by induction because they certainly don't follow logically from any finite number of statements like this. Right? That is no contradiction in my giving a list of 1,000,000 dogs who are always hungry. And then saying, but this is not true because here's another dog that isn't always hungry, right? There's no contradiction. So, so if this does somehow follow, or if it even follows that it's more probable, because this is probable is itself a statement that has to be proved, right? So if it follows that this is true, or if it follows that this is probable from a finite number of statements like this, then it has to be a non-logical kind of following. And Popper says, what could that be? That could only be an empirical law of nature. It's not logical. He says, well, Kant made a valiant, or I guess he says ingenious attempt to show that no, there are some things there are some principles that are neither logical nor empirical. They're synthetic a priori. We know, we can know not based on experience that certain things follow from other things. But Popper says, although he doesn't explain why, in this place anyway, Kant's attempt failed. So this either has to be a logical consequence or an empirical consequence. That is, it has to follow by a law of nature. And Popper says, well, if it's not a logical consequence, and he is just paraphrasing Hume here, basically, Hume on causality. And if it's an empirical consequence, well, how do we know that? Right? I mean, this itself is going to be a big universal statement for all theories. If a finite number of instances are true, then the theory is probable. How do we learn that? It's not a logical truth. Right? We started with that. This isn't a logical consequence. It's not a tautology, as Popper would understand that. It's an empirical truth. It's an empirical universal statement. According to these people, we would have to establish it by induction. So the principle that we need to believe in induction would have to itself be established by induction. And obviously that's either an infinite regress of like super induction principles, or it probably, that's the way Popper describes it, or it's probably easier just to say it'd be circular. We'd be using the principle to establish itself. So Popper says induction can't be the answer. That is, there is no solution to the problem of induction, or to Hume's problem, as he also calls it. And because there is no solution to the problem, how this could follow or follow with high probability from a bunch of statements like this, it's totally unsuitable as a demarcation criterion. that theories be inductively provable. No theories are inductively provable. No theories of the right kind are inductively provable. But he says, notice something about this. This is the same as, well, I hope you learned this in Phil 9. Right? This is the same as this. That does not exist in X such that this is not true of X. And this is not true of X means that uh, right? That's the negation of the implication. I mean, you can get this in a few steps, but you can look at it, you can just see this means that the consequent is false and the antecedent is true. That means the implication is wrong, right? So, so although no finite number of statements like this could prove this, it just takes one to disprove it. Right? Because this says there does not exist any X such this is true of it. So if I produce any, even a single such X, then I've contradicted the principle. So there's an asymmetry. Singular statements don't prove universal statements, but they do disprove universal statements. See that I'm out of time. So I'm going to have to finish saying some things about this next time. And this obviously is the main point, but I'll say a little bit more next time. See you then. Hopefully the recording will